We have with us today Jack Hanrahan, who will be talking about the Freedom Summer of 1964. Not all that long ago, but in some ways a very different time as well. So we'll be talking about the events of that period, that summer, and what has happened since then, and what sort of relevance it might have for us today as we think about the issue of civil rights. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. And we'll start with just a basic description of what happened in the summer of 1964 in Mississippi.
I'll keep it basic because I have some slides that deal with this. So the previous fall, there was an effort led by some students from schools like Yale and Princeton to give blacks in Mississippi who had very low voter registration at the time the chance to understand the registration process, what it was going to be like, take some of the fear out of going to a registrar's office, and to understand what the voting process would be like. So they held a parallel election to the off-year election in Mississippi. They have them like we have them here in Virginia. And out of that, and a few other events that I can talk about, came the idea of having Freedom Summer, where there would be two goals. One would be to continue voter registration, and the other one would be to have freedom schools, where both adults and young people could be taught things that they weren't learning in school if they were in school. There were 3 volunteers. There were many volunteers that went to university and having a university campus in Ohio that I'll talk about, that were trained in this, were somewhat put through like boot camp in some way to get them prepared to be in Mississippi for the summer. And they, very mixed group, blacks and whites together. I do describe the groups in the presentation a little bit deeper. But 3 of those volunteers had to leave early because a church that they were going to use for one of those freedom schools in the Longdale section of Philadelphia, Mississippi, was burned to the ground midweek. So Andrew Goodman, a volunteer, talk more about Andrew, Michael Schwerner, an organizer in Meridian, and his colleague, also an organizer in Meridian, Mississippi, James Chaney, left at 3 in the morning on Saturday the 20th, arriving in Meridian, time to get some sleep and get up the next morning and go to Philadelphia. And that story is what will unfold.
Great, great. Are there some particular slides you want to share with us as we get acclimated?
I would.
Okay, let's
yeah,
go ahead and do that.
I'll try to go through these quickly so we have a lot more time for discussion and questions. So I do want to thank all of you, thank Reverend Justin, Paul, and everyone involved with the Rectors Forum for inviting me back. It's really an honor to be back. When I was here last year, I talked about the book that I had written on civil rights history and travel, and took you on a quick tour around about a dozen places in the South. Today I'm focused on Philadelphia, Philadelphia, Mississippi, so you can see on this map that I'm putting right in the middle of your tour if you begin in Atlanta. I mentioned that the book goes beyond those 12 destinations to cover the states in which those 12 cities are, and those are outlined in red. It goes beyond those to cover by a dedicated chapter each of the southern states that border those 5 states, and goes beyond the South to give people in different sections of the country a chance to connect with African American history and the civil rights movement closer to home. I mentioned last year that this is not an income-producing book for me. It is a charitable orientation that I have to donate money to Legal Aid here in Charlottesville, where I've been a volunteer for over a decade now, and Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. So we'll get into Freedom Summer, 1964. Focuses on Philadelphia, where I've already talked about those 3 young men arriving there on June 21st. We'll get into the day by day, but on June 21st, 1964, the three went missing, and their bodies were recovered about 7 weeks later, on August 4th. And I'll talk about that. You may wonder, like, who are these people, and why did they go there, and where were the bodies found, and we may have a lot of other questions, and most importantly, were the guilty ever punished? So I talked about that freedom vote, parallel election that took place. Its goal was to build familiarity, It was a success to a degree. They had hoped that 200,000 adults would go through this parallel vote. About 82,000 did, but it did accomplish some good things. And just to put the year 1963 into context, we've already experienced some of these anniversaries. The two in Birmingham, for example, earlier in the year, the Children's Crusade that we talked about last year, where teenagers and even young children marched to the streets, hosed by fire hoses of a very powerful nature, attacked by German Shepherd dogs for the police. And then, of course, a few weeks ago, we experienced the 60th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Avenue church, where 4 little girls were killed. A lot of the country had lunch counter sit-ins, starting in 1960, February of 1960 in Greensboro, not that far from here. And Jackson was still having these sit-ins. Shows you where Mississippi was in terms of progress. And the lunch counter attack in Jackson is one of the worst that ever happened. Of course, in June of that year, Medgar Evers, the field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, was assassinated in the driveway. And of course, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November. Why did they focus on Mississippi for this Freedom Summer? Well, black registration was bad across many states in the South, but none like Mississippi. Only 6.7% of blacks were registered in Mississippi, deterred by things like a poll tax, which would equal in that currency about a month's salary just to try to register to vote. Tests that were done that would have you pick a piece of paper out of a bowl that would say, recite the such and such section of the U.S. Constitution or the Mississippi Constitution. So you can see the percentages for the other states, while not high, were much higher than Mississippi. And the state actually ran itself and its hostility toward blacks almost like with a sense of pride. The riots that took place in 1962 when James Meredith tried to and eventually did succeed at registering at Ole Miss in Oxford, killed 2 people, lots of buildings damaged. If you go there, you'll still see bullet holes. They're not from the Civil War, I'll tell you that. They're from these demonstrations. And the state had its own spy agency, in essence, Sovereignty Commission, headquartered on the 4th floor, for a time anyway, of the State House. They actually hired a black man to infiltrate the Freedom Summer training in Oxford, Ohio, and he gave the state, and the state gave to some of these ne'er-do-wells the license plate of Mickey Schroeder's car. That's how they knew when Schroeder had returned to the state of Mississippi. Bob Moses, who you'll see a number of pictures, who was really in the state from 1961 on, tried to do voter registration, had a great quote that I put in the bottom of this particular slide about why Mississippi. The Negroes of Mississippi will not get the vote until the equivalent of an army is here. And I can't call the 1,000 or so volunteers that came to the state in 1964 an army, but it was a start. There was a lot of controversy about whether they would go forward with Freedom Summer. There was a lot of concern about the white volunteers. first, how many would actually show up, how many would come, and whether they would take over. I mean, people like Bob Moses and Hollis Watkins and many others had worked hard to register black voters in the state for 3 years. And suddenly this influx of white college students mixed with blacks that had worked in Mississippi, there was a concern about them just taking the process over. And then, since they were students, what was the degree of commitment that they would bring? What was their attitude toward doing this work? And was it a here today, gone tomorrow type of attitude? And because the people of Mississippi, and particularly the law enforcement community in Mississippi, looked at this as an invasion. They call these students intruders, invaders, other labels that I'll not get into. And there's a massive danger of violence. The people who came had to have enough money to post their bail, and they had to have the powers of attorney papers filled out before they were allowed to leave the training. A key turning point was a murder that happened in January of the key year, 1964. The gentleman pictured there is Lewis Allen. Mr. Allen, had witnessed the murder a few years back of a friend of his, and he remained silent for a number of years and then decided he would talk. And once he decided he would talk to the FBI about that other murder, his days were numbered. He was actually leaving for Chicago to get out of Mississippi the following day, but his murder occurred. And that was a big impetus to having Freedom Summer. And that big guy like Bob Moses, who was one of those that were on the fence, 100% committed. So all this training that I've talked about took place at the Western College for Women. And now that is part of Miami University of Ohio. There were 2 different weeks of training, a week for the people who were going to help with voter registration. And that's where Mickey Schwerner and, they were involved in both things, to be honest. Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney were involved in both. But in between those 2 weeks, they left and they took a volunteer by the name of Andrew Goodman with them, figuring he, after seeing him in some of these training exercises, had the right temperament for overseeing this freedom school in the Mount Zion church. I described these 2 groups. One group is pretty much a white group from somewhat elite schools. The author of the book where I got the description from said most of them had guitars, and they dressed in American bandstand fashion, capri pants, polo shirts, and so on. The other group was mostly black. They were already working in Mississippi. They came there to bring some realism to the training. They didn't bring guitars. They wore denim overalls and white T-shirts. The picture is from a departure that happened. Bob Moses told that group, Bob Moses passed away a couple of years ago, very Harvard-educated man, very bright mathematician, but very dedicated to the civil rights movement. Had many acts of violence directed toward him and threats toward him. But he told the students in his soft voice, don't come to Mississippi this summer to save the Mississippi Negro. Only come if you understand, really understand, that his freedom and yours are one. Bruce Watson, an author of a book on Freedom Summer, talked about the training to bring realism to these volunteers who had come from somewhat pushy lives. And he said, like sergeants at a boot camp, those trainers felt duty-bound to turn innocent idealists into anxious, even terrified realists. So I talked about June 20th, 1964. Mickey Schwerner gets up at 3 in the morning, kisses his wife Rita, also in Ohio for this training, goodbye, tells them that he and James and Andrew, this new volunteer that they've recruited, are going to travel through the night to get to Meridian, Mississippi. And they do. They get there, and these are the three men. As you'll see in a moment or two, this is from the missing poster that the FBI put out when the men went missing on June 21st. Andrew Goodman, let's start with Andrew since he's on the left there. 20-year-old, Queens College, New York student, lives in a very cushy atmosphere on the Upper West Side of New York. His parents were connected to, his dad was a lawyer, they were connected to the theater in New York. Zero Mostel would stay at their parents' apartment. Leonard Bernstein, I hope some of you remember those names, would play the piano at their apartment to entertain. James Chaney came from a very different environment. James Chaney from Meridian, Mississippi. He left to go to the training when his wife was pregnant and his daughter was about to be delivered. And so he missed the birth of his daughter by being away. He didn't know that the daughter had been born, though, before he died. Michael Schwarter, known as Goatee to the people who kidnapped him because of that little beard that he had. He was also from in New York, married to Rita, had been involved in the civil rights movement for a couple of years, based in Mississippi, and very much the target of the attack that occurred. The file that was set to the Mount Zion Baptist Church was set to attract him back to the area. And this all comes from the Sovereignty Commission files and some of the testimony of people who turned on the perpetrators of the event, the murder. So June 21st comes, they leave Meridian to head toward Philadelphia, Mississippi. Andrew has put a postcard in the mail to his parents. You may be able to detect the postmark there. It says June 21st from Meridian, addressed to Robert and Mrs. Robert Goodman on Upper West Side of New York, West 86th Street. In the postcard, they decide that you can't read. He's basically telling what a wonderful town this is. He feels very welcomed, and the weather is great. You know, all the things that you could fit on a postcard when you're a college student running back. And their destination was the Mount Zion Church, which the larger picture below is taken at. That's Bob Moses, standing on the rubble of the burned out church. The church was rebuilt. You can visit it if you go to Philadelphia. The bell, I think I talked about this last year, the bell at the church is the only thing that survived, and it stands defiant in the courtyard. By mid-afternoon, they knew they needed to get back. They had met the people at the church. They had made a decision about whether the church obviously couldn't serve as the location, but they felt they could find a place where they could continue a freedom school. And they headed back because one of the dictates of being a civil rights worker in Mississippi in 1964 was you don't travel after dark. You get out of town. And even though June 21st, Father's Day, the longest day of the year, had plenty of sunlight left, they left in plenty of time to get back to Meridian. But they didn't make it. Chaney driving, if you ever saw the movie Mississippi Burning, which we will talk about, Chaney was the driver, not Mickey Schwerner, as it shows in the movie. And I'll talk about the movie later in a second. Because he was allegedly speeding, they were thrown in jail, separate cells, of course, separate police cars actually transporting them. Segregation went a long way in Mississippi in those days, barely. And of course, it's after dark, 10:20 p.m., they are released and they don't make it back to Meridian. And one of the other things that was a rule was when people don't show up and it's dark, you start making calls to jails to see if they're in jail, call hospitals to see if they're in an accident or something else, and they also started to call the FBI. Rita, who's worried that she may now be a widow, is one of those people making the call, Rita Schwarter. At 6:55 a.m., when the gunman called back to the jail, the Neshoba County Jail in Philadelphia, Mississippi, they find out that those men were in jail and that they were released late at night. At 9:30 in the morning, Bob Moses gets in front of the assembled group at the Western College for Women and lets them know that 3 volunteers who were here with you last week have gone missing. And as you would imagine, an alarm rippled through the auditorium. At 6 o'clock, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, orders a full investigation. So the federal reaction was pretty quick, at least from the executive branch, the Attorney General. I would actually say, reading the stuff, that the FBI also dug in pretty heavily, even though some in the FBI had a tough reputation as it related to civil rights matters. Walter Cronkite, who, for those of you who weren't around in 1964, was the newscast of choice for most Americans. He tells the nation that 3 civil rights had gone missing. And after dark that night, 2 more bombings occur. The next day, Tuesday, the local paper doesn't carry anything about this. There's nothing about it. But people in Philadelphia, Mississippi know that something is up. They've got all these men in sunglasses and briefcases walking around town. They saw that the FBI was all over this little hotel on the outskirts of town setting up their headquarters. And they, and many politicians, Senator James Eastland, maybe a name that you know of Mississippi, he tells the President of the United States that, oh, they're just hiding. You know, this is a hoax. They'll show up. Nothing to worry about here. But the President hears a different message from Kennedy's Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach. And he tells Johnson, I wouldn't be surprised if they were murdered. So people knew what the outcome was likely to be. That same day, late in the afternoon, their car is discovered. I'm going to show you a map in a second or two as I wrap up. That, you know, this location is out northeast, about 16 miles northeast of Philadelphia, Mississippi. The jail is in the heart of Mississippi, and other key locations are southwest where they were buried. So there was clearly a conspiracy going on here. When the FBI reaches this car, it's too hot. They can't touch it because it's still hot from the fire. And for the next 7 weeks, the nation faces this missing poster with the 3 young men. Their bodies are found on August 4th. So June 21st to August 4th, they have been on the minds of the nation, and now that we know that they were buried in this gigantic earthen dam, brand new earthen dam. The FBI, excuse me, rented a helicopter. They went over. There's a lot of dams, I guess, in this part of Mississippi, but they could see one that had the redness of the earth being so fresh, and they began to search there. They actually had a tip as to where this was, so it wasn't a needle in a haystack kind of discovery. The picture on the right shows you how far off the road that burial site is, and Google Maps has this location labeled, the location of the bodies of the Freedom Summer murders victims. But if you go, don't go on that. It's still private property. But, you know, lay some flowers or something there on the road. These are those locations. The upper right here is the swamp where that car was found. Over there is the Jolly Farm. Down here is where the murder occurred. The church that they went to is over here. So there's a lot of movement related to this particular crime. The president and Hoover speak the following day after the bodies are discovered, rather. And the FBI chief, Hoover, says that they know who did this. The deputy sheriff and the sheriff are both involved, says Hoover. Services are held for the men. Dr. King raises this tragedy when he accepts his Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo a little bit later in the year. 2 years later, he comes back to Philadelphia, and he's speaking on the steps. That's the steps of the Neshoba County Courthouse. When King gets the microphone, he makes this bold statement that the murderers are somewhere around me. From behind him, some people speculate it was Deputy Sheriff Price. He hears, "You're damn right they are." Moving to the last couple of slides that deal with the quest to bring justice for these victims. Later that year, the FBI arrested 21 Klansmen. And they were not state murder charges. The Mississippi state government did not bring any charges. But with a states' rights issue on the minds of this U.S. commissioner or judge in Meridian, she dismisses the charges against everybody. The federal government appeals. 19 of the 21 are indicted a month later. Those charges are dismissed, except for the 2 lawmen, where there's apparently a different standard. But in 1966, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to that judge's decision, and 18 of the indictments are reinstated. That trial begins, and moving quickly to the result, Deputy Cecil Price is convicted along with 6 others. The longest time anybody serves is 6 years, and that's a gentleman who's the head of the White Knights of the Klan in the Meridian area, Samuel Bowers. He gets 10 years and serves 6. Chief Rainey, Sheriff Rainey, and 7 others are found guilty, and there's a hung jury on 3 others, including the alleged ringleader, Edgar Lee Killen. Not much happens after that 67 trial, but there's a film that comes out in 1988, is nominated for an Oscar. Best Picture Oscar, does not win. In 1989, and it's Mississippi Burning. The gentleman pictured here is Jerry Mitchell. Jerry Mitchell is a relatively new reporter in Jackson, Mississippi, at the time anyway. And he happens to get the assignment, he wants the assignment to go to the premiere of the movie. It just so happens he's sitting next to a guy who, when the movie shows Mickey Schroeder driving the car, he hears the gentleman next to him go, "That didn't happen." And this guy makes several comments of, "That's real," or, talking under his breath. After the film is ended, Jerry talks with this gentleman. He's the special agent from the FBI who was involved in the case. He meets another FBI agent, and he gets deeply into the case. His book is phenomenal, Race Against Time, and I would highly recommend it. It's very readable. He's obviously a good writer, good journalist. In his investigation, Jerry Mitchell, learns that the Mississippi Department of Archives and History did an interview with Samuel Bowers, who's the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan leader. And in that interview was sealed, but because it was used in a court case, Jerry gets to hear it. And he hears an interviewer say to Bowers, "Do you regret being in jail?" And Bowers' answer is something to the effect, "I don't regret it because the main instigator of all of this is walking free." So Jerry Mitchell begins a quest to find out who this main instigator is. And with the assistance of lawmen, to the degree that they can assist a journalist, he learns that it's Edgar Ray Killen, who is that handsome gentleman down at the bottom, and his red squared face is above. This is Samuel Bowers, the KKK guy. This Geraldine was the land on which the bodies were found. Let's get going here. In 2005, they bring a case, a murder case, first person charged with murder in the trial in all this time against Killen, and he's indicted. The trial begins at the courthouse where Martin Luther King spoke. It's a mixed jury, but whites predominate. There's tremendous press attention. It's on court TV. You probably can watch some of the testimonies to this day if you're interested in it. None of the living defendants from the past trials would testify, but there's a rule in Mississippi: if you are deceased or unable to come to trial for reasons that the state can prove, you can, and that witness was cross-examined. That's an important part. You can use that testimony. There was a lot of concern about whether people would be reacting to read testimony in this trial, but that was a major element. Of course, the state forgot to get the proof that all these people were dead, so the trial came to a grinding halt so they could do that. On June 21st, a date that you might remember had some importance because it's the date they went missing. That handsome gentleman in the yellow jumpsuit was found guilty of manslaughter, 43 years to the day since they went missing. And he got 3 consecutive 20-year terms, which was the maximum. And he spent the rest of his life, actually he did spend the rest of his life in Parchman prison. He eventually went to Parchman because it wasn't a murder charge. He was allowed to get bail, pretty substantial bail, but he paid the bail, $600,000. Part of it was his condition there. You might be able to tell he's in a wheelchair, and he's pretty old at that point. But somebody sees him pumping gas at a local gas station, and they tell that to the judge. The judge revokes bail. He goes into Parchman for the rest of his life. All appeals are good. Last slide. Fast forward to the 50th anniversary, 2014. Among many others that received the Presidential Medal of Freedom are these 3 civil rights workers. That's President Obama giving the medal to Rita Schroeder Bender, that remarried, and he utters, it's always good to end with an Obama quote. And on that day, President Obama said, "While they are often remembered for how they died, we honor them today for how they lived with the idealism and courage of youth." A good thought to leave us all with as we open it up. Hope I didn't take up too much of your time.
Oh, no, it's great.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, let's see what questions you all have for Jack. Any questions?
Paul?
Yes, Paul.
Jack, I assume you've been back to Meridian and Philadelphia. Does the culture change there at all? Or is it just buried just below the surface?
I haven't been back there since 2018. But when I was there, I would say it's a pretty insular town. I mean, it's physically isolated. It's not much bigger than it was in 1964. Its population is 7,000-ish today, and it was 6,000-ish in 1964. It's a lot like Selma was. I felt there was a lot of parallels between those 2 somewhat sleepy towns. I think, along with the state, there have been good things that have happened in Mississippi. There were a lot of individuals elected who had more open mind. I mean, when you read the way some of the people who were charged with these crimes in 1964 talked, that has really changed. I mean, I guess I would say there's been some change, but it's still not,
Not the Upper West Side.
yeah, not Charlottesville.
Was there anybody who was believed to be, I guess reasonably believed to be involved in the plot who was never charged?
Who was never charged. There were people who took immunity deals. They would never charge. Because a couple of those people were dead by the time Killen's trial came about. Those statements could not be read. Those are the only ones that I can think of. The preacher's wife was not charged. Preacher Killen, Edgar Ray Killen. It's hard to imagine that she wasn't involved. The murder took place pretty close to their property. The sign that I showed you, I'm kind of a little detour here. The sign that I showed you at the beginning, where it says the murders were taking place near here, there's a road that goes up. It's called the Rock Cut Road. And Edgar Ray Killen lived up there, and the FBI files indicate that the murders took place there.
Yeah. Jack, one thing that's struck me profoundly in your talk is the ironies. There are just multiple ironies in this. One is the name of the town.
Yeah.
Philadelphia. It's literally city of brotherly love or brotherly love. The irony that you're in this domestic, middle of the country state, and what is essentially being described is war. It sounds almost exactly as like when people went off to World War I. They came with a certain idealism. They didn't know what they were really getting into.
From the word invader.
Invaders, right. There was the quote going from idealist to terrified realist.
Right.
That sounds like what people experience before they go to war.
Training.
Right.
Yeah.
The police, who are supposed to be the enforcers of the law and justice, are the perpetrators of injustice, and on and on. What do we make of that? What is this? This is a big question, I suppose, but what does this tell us about human beings and about the whole struggle for racial justice and justice in general? What are your reflections on that?
So, not just this incident, this murder in Philadelphia, the church bombing in Birmingham. You could just name crime after crime. These were committed by folks that would be in church on Sunday.
I forgot that irony too.
Yeah.
That he's a preacher.
He's a preacher. He was part-time preacher, but he would preach at different Baptist churches. In fact, he was with that hung jury. It was 11 to 1 vote. With a 1 vote, I'm sorry, but my little side trip here. The 1 vote that wouldn't convict him in 1967 was a woman, very religious woman, who just couldn't get to herself to think that a man of God would have done anything like that to those poor young men. So that was why he was not convicted back then. So I've always struggled with this whole thing of how could people who go to hear the messages like we heard at the service at 8:15 today, get themselves to a place where they would even think about doing something like this. It just shows you the hatred and how they really didn't listen to the Word of God. They just, ignored what Christ said. On the other hand, I think of people like these 3 young men and many, many, many others whose names we don't know, who just went into harm's way, put their own personal safety at risk, because they actually did listen to the Word of God. you know, the closing prayer, I actually wanted to take a picture of that page, you know, where the really closing prayer in service helped me with this, but let me try it. Do all you can as you are able, you know, is a message that they took to heart, you know, and we all take to heart. I mean, you know, as you are able, you know, if it's as simple as writing the letters to shut-ins so that they know that someone's thinking about them, that is something that, you know, we can do to have a shelter for the unhoused and give them a place to get a hot meal and you know, donate or volunteer at a food pantry. And there's so many things that good can come out of and the story that I told today. Excuse me.
Thank you, Jack. What other questions do we have for Jack?
I have a question.
Yes, Lisa.
Probably more for you. So I lived in Atlanta quite a while, and they just recently had an anniversary of the Atlanta massacre. And the entire time I lived in Atlanta, I never heard about that until much later. Like, you know, at the son that lives in Tulsa, we know about the Black Wall Street massacre that happened there. So my observation with both cities is that, well, Atlanta will recognize it maybe once a year, and there are small groups that will be more. When you go to Tulsa, you'll see reference to it in the airport. There are art galleries devoted to it. You can go to Black Wall Street and trace the steps of the event and walk and learn about it. So I feel like Tulsa really owns that event. So you see two cities with similar events that have different responses.
Right.
So my question is, as Christians, how do we respond to having this knowledge moving forward? Do we act more like Atlanta? Do we act more like Tulsa, or is there something else?
Great. What do you think, Jen? You're a Christian.
That was to you.
Well, I'll jump in one, but you're a Christian. You're a believer. You've spent a lot of time wrestling with this history. What does this history mean for you as a Christian? How are you to respond to that? How should we respond to it?
So I think the first way to respond is to remember it and talk about it and share it with other people. And that's sort of why, after taking this trip in 2018 and talking with friends and sharing my experiences and what it meant to me emotionally, you know, people would say, you should write a book. And I laughed it off a little bit until someone said, well, at least write a chapter. And I did, and it turned into a book. So remember it, talk about it, share it. And then the fourth verb I would put out, into the degree that you are able, using that last reading, follow it. Follow what your what your takeaway is from what those three young men did, or what a person like Medgar Evers did in Mississippi. It cost him his life. Try to make a difference. You know, act in some fashion as you are able. You know, so those are what I try to do as a Christian. Remember it and talk about it, honor it, and try my best to follow it. Yeah.
Yeah, memory is a very complicated and controversial thing, right? And your comment immediately made me think about an experience I had when I was younger, and I went to Germany and was struck immediately by the number of Holocaust memorials everywhere, even right downtown in Berlin, right by essentially the capital of Berlin. Churches that had been bombed, left, destroyed. You can't avoid being reminded of this past.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please, yeah.
And even when you walk around, and it's not just in Berlin or in Germany, are you familiar with, I'm not going to try the German, they're called stumble stones.
Yeah.
So outside of places where Jews were taken from, there will be this slight elevation, a little this plaque, if you will, embedded in the sidewalk, and it's meant that you would stumble over the stone and remember what happened here. My wife and I were fortunate enough to take a trip to the Bordeaux area, and I'm walking around, and boom, I trip over one of these stumble stones in Bordeaux, France. So they are all over the place. I mean, think of how many stumble stones we could have in this country of memorials to events that perhaps people don't want us to remember as Americans. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that especially when it comes to issues around race and our history with race, we don't actually have enough tangible, concrete reminders for people, particularly for things like lynchings. Most people don't really know that history very well. They don't realize that there are lynching sites all around us. There's, in fact, my understanding is there's one down by Farmington, in that area, that a lynching took place there. In my last church, I discovered that some of my parishioners had been connected to an event in 1930, a lynching that took place right around the church. So these things are right there in the past, but there's no marker for it. There's no remembrance. And they only get talked about. People like you or others come and dig it up. But this, for me, thinking about the Christian response, it makes me think about our own time, right? So you tell this story. It's clear that the society as a whole, in many ways, is supporting what's going on at institutional levels, at cultural levels, right? And what are we perhaps supporting and noticing in our own time? This looks clear cut to us, right? We look at this and we go, this is clearly wrong. How could anybody have been supportive of this? How could the police have done this? This is just, this murder, right? Cut and dry.
And one thing that I didn't mention, that the place where that car was found, burnt out, no memorial marker. Obviously, there's no memorial marker on the property where the bodies were discovered, but there's also none on the state road. So, I mean, there's lots and lots of places where there should be memory items, whether it's a plaque or a highway marker or something like that, that just aren't there. One of the things that I'm trying to do now is to write a book on the first 20 years of Frederick Douglass's life in Maryland. And it's shameful, in my opinion, how little of his life is remembered by Maryland. It's just very bothersome. So the hope is by pointing out places where there should be a memorial, there should be a marker, there should be something. Something can happen.
So maybe the memorial then can spark us to be more self-reflective about our own time.
You know, even to take children or your grandchildren to a place. I mean, the lynching that occurred near Farmington, there's no marker there because it's probably private property. But you know, Paul and I were fortunate to go to an event there, and when I went over the railroad tracks, I looked to my left and said there should be a marker there. There is one on the courthouse square to remember the lynching that occurred there, and that's good. But you know, how about another one?
Well, Jack, I think we've come to the end of our time, but thank you so much for being with us today and to sharing this story and getting into some of the details. Let's give Jack a round of applause. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.